Greetings and welcome. In this episode, I get to finally paint the last model that I had to do in the Legion's Imperialis core box set. I'm going to be painting this Warhound Titan as the Legio Astorum, and it's going to be accompanying my Theta Garmin Loyalist Solar Auxiliary Army, here at Bunker 6. Before we do anything, we're going to want to sub-assemble and prime the model. I like to keep the model sub-assembled like this just so I have better control over where my airbrush is going. And here are the parts, as much as I was willing to sub-assemble them. I decided to get the metallic silver out of the way first because it was one of the biggest sections that needed doing. And then I moved on to base coating all the sections that needed blue. This is quite a dark blue, but we are going to be adding highlights down the road. Now, aside from all these body panels that have been airbrushed blue, you will want to paint the toes blue as well, but you'll have to do that with a paintbrush. Now we're going to be moving on to the blue highlights. We're just focusing on corners and raised edges. Just a little reminder, always test your airbrush on the side of your hand or on a piece of kitchen towel or something before you start painting on the model, just in case the airbrush has a little blockage and then it blasts out a bunch of paint all over your lovely work. The highlights are being focused towards the tops of most of these leg panels, like a Zenithal highlight would be. I'm starting off with Games Workshop's Aveland Sunset for the yellow sections. This is a lovely opaque base coat paint, and as you can see, it's got really great coverage. We're going to be building up with highlights right after this. Keeping it pretty subtle with a real yellow highlight, really focusing only on the top part of the head, obviously to create some contrast. To make the yellow transition a little bit smoother, I'm going to be adding some Vallejo transparent yellow over the entirety of the yellow sections, and this will just create a bit more of a smoother blend, and also makes the yellow really pop. To add a little bit of shading, I'm just using some Scrag Brown here. We will be doing some oil washing too, but I think just adding a touch of this orangey brown onto the model before the oil wash will help really sell the darker side of the contrasts in all of the yellow sections. Now you want to be doing the opposite of what you were doing with the highlights, and it's focusing on the lower parts of the model and the recesses of the model instead. With the yellow in a place that I was happy with, I was able to move on to the additional sections of the model that required metallics. The trick with oil washing is knowing what you want to have already painted before the oil wash even goes on, and what you want not painted and can be painted over the oil wash later down the road. A lot of the times with oil washes, it's going to really dull down a lot of your metallics, so always be mindful that you might need to go back over metallics later on if you are planning on applying them prior to the oil wash. I do like applying them before the oil wash because I still want some of that dirtiness over the metallics so that I can always have the ability to highlight again later on. As previously mentioned, you're not going to be able to get all of the blue sections or yellow sections done with an airbrush, so we're going to be going in with a paintbrush and doing some of the blue parts that we were not able to do earlier. Now, as previously mentioned, you only want to do metallics that you don't mind getting dulled down by the oil wash, and so we're just going to do a solid base coat of the trim for now. Once all the trim was done and I was happy with all the base coats, I then sealed everything with Rust-Oleum matte varnish prior to the oil wash. Along with the oil wash, I also needed to seal the panels because of the stripes that we needed to do. I don't want the tape here being able to pull up the rather fragile base coat paints, so if they're locked in, it's less likely that when I peel off these stripes, it's also going to do damage to the paint underneath the tape. With the stripes, the width and angle of the stripes is completely up to you. I decided to go with a slightly thinner stripe than the actual width of the original size of the tape, just because the model scale is quite small, so I didn't want the stripes to look disproportionate to the scale of the model. If you're having issues with the tape on sharp corners like this, cut up multiple sections to create the continuity of the stripe over that bend. I also sealed over the stripes just so there wasn't any seepage. Thank you to the YouTube comments for that idea. I then moved on to spraying down the base coat for the white stripes, which is a light grey. We're going to be hitting the white as the main highlight on the top parts of all of these panels in the next stage. Making sure that we really keep the airbrush on a 90-degree angle with the stripes to reduce the likelihood of paint seeping under the stripes. As mentioned, the white highlight is next, really just focusing on the top edge like a zenithal highlight. Same goes for these shoulder pads. We will run into some issues, obviously, where the paint has managed to get under the tape, but that's not too much of an issue. We can just either treat it like battle damage and actually use it to our advantage and lean into some of those areas where it's gone under, and we can kind of treat it like the paint's been scratched or something, or we can actually just tighten it up with the original blue colors. In this first shot, you get to see me pull away the tape and where some of that overspray has hit. In this second shot, you can see how I've tidied up the overspray on the shoulder pad section, and it looks quite nice. So we're going to do a base coat of black right in the eye socket. It can be any black, you're not going to really see it. Just make sure it's flat and even. Then we're going to be moving on to the green reflective nature of the lens. We're going to start with the darkest green first. That's going to be taking up the most amount of area on the lens, about 2/3 of the lens. Start from the front corner, working your way back. Make sure that you are pulling the paint though into the front of the lens when it comes to the lighter greens, because you don't want to be pulling it into the middle of the lens, because that's not where you want the paint to accumulate. You want the paint to accumulate at the front of the lens like so. And we're going to be working our way up through the different brighter colors up into a yellow, just so everything looks bright and reflective. As with most highlights, the brighter the highlight gets, the less area it is taking up in the area that you're painting. So as you can see, the brighter sections are getting smaller and smaller, just so you don't lose the previous darker layer that's beneath it. One thing that might be missed in the video, and I just want to make it clear, is aside from pushing this bright yellow into the corner of the lens, I also have a thin line of yellow running along the bottom of the lens too. It just sells the idea of it being glassy a little bit more. You can always tidy up any mistakes with the previous greens. And one dot of white paint in the opposite end of the lens, where it's the darkest, really hits home the idea of the reflective nature of the lens. On the snout of the Warhound are 4 little lights. I base coated these in white, and now I'm just going over them with a couple of layers of Cassandra yellow. It's a transparent, inky wash, and I do want that white to still cut through to give the illusion that it's a light. If you're new to oils and things like that, it can be a little bit intimidating at first, but I thoroughly recommend it. Agrex Earthshade obviously has its uses, and I use it too, but with oil washing, the amount of flexibility you have and results that you can get from it are absolutely incredible compared to things like Agrex Earthshade. You will find that you can create some masterful effects very easily. With Agrex Earthshade, it's an acrylic paint, so it's very difficult to rework it, practically impossible actually, whereas with oils, you can go back and forth with oils over and over and over again, and you can get fantastic and stunning results very easily. You don't need to be technical with a paintbrush, it's a case of just scraping things off and cleaning them, rather than being very technical and accurate like you have to be with acrylic paints. You can always go back in and wipe things down, re-varnish, re-clean, re-oil, do it over and over and over again until you've got a result that you're happy with. If you haven't tried it, just varnish up a model and start throwing some oil down. The key is though not to leave the oil on the model for too long, because you don't want it to dry out to the point where it is very difficult to be pulled off the model. As you can see here, I'm using a variety of tools. I'm using sponges, old brushes, whatever works best for that part of the model. With sponges, you're trying to create surface texture. With brushes, you're trying to create staining generally, and weathering, like rain obviously falling down consistently over certain panels, and oil streaming out of certain joints consistently, and things like that. The amount of options that you have with oil is just remarkable, so I'm highly recommending it basically. And once you've got confident with oils, you can then move into things like enamels, which is something I haven't touched on this channel yet, but I will be doing that in the near future. Good thing about oils as well is it could be used as weathering or it could be used as shading. We're actually using it as both on this particular model, and I generally like to do that because it keeps things feeling a bit more uniform. Things aren't standing out so much. In the historical model making world, it's called filters when you're painting things like tanks and stuff like that. And it's kind of like a filter here too. We're basically using this oil as a filter to sort of mask and bring everything that's happening underneath the oil wash together. And once the matte varnish is applied, the magic is finally revealed because that sheen has gone from the oil and now it's flat and it looks much more natural and realistic, as you can see here. One part that I like to have specific control over outside of the oil wash is the scrolls. I have a very specific color choice and way of doing things that actually involves Agrax Earthshade. You see, it does have its uses. The Agrax Earthshade can be really concentrated over these scrolls and look really, really rich. So that's what we're going to be doing here. As you can see, the Agrax really likes to pool in all those crevices really nicely. I'll be giving it about 15 to 20 minutes to let this dry off, and then we'll go in with the base color again and a highlight. One thing to make sure is that the Agrax Earthshade also pulls around the outside edge of the scrolls, just so it feels like it's in place and it's got a bit of a black outline to it. Once the Agrax Earthshade is dry, I'm now going to go back in with dark sand just around the edges to bring a little bit more life back into the scroll sections, and to give a little bit more pop, just going to be adding a tiny amount of pale sand into all of the corners as well. As previously mentioned, the oil wash and the matte varnish will dull down any metallics, so we're just going to go back in now and brighten things up a little bit. I'm going to be focusing the brighter areas in between the rivets and leave the shading around the rivets as much as possible. I start with Victorian brass, and I'm going to slowly start adding in elven gold into the mixture where I want things to be brighter. The transfers that I'm going to be using on this Warhound are by Impatient Tabletop. Lovely quality, and you're going to find them very easy to work with as well. Some of the larger star chart transfers that I'm going to be applying will require some Mark Fit solution, which is a softener for transfers. It's very useful stuff. I don't normally need to use it, but I'm going to be doing these star charts over some curved areas, and it would help just make things a little bit more manageable. If you can't find Mark Fit by Tamiya, you can always use Microsol solution, which is an alternative. The trick is, for me, I don't like to do too much of this stuff all at once because you can actually start to damage the transfer. I'll put the transfer down with water first, and then I'll go back in with Microsol or Mark Fit afterwards. You'll start to see the transfer slightly shrink. What you want to do is just get your paintbrush like this and start to brush out any of those creases that you may see. Do take your time with this though, because you can start to damage the transfer if you do too much of the solution. Now, this is a step that you might not want to do, but I find that it works quite well. I will then slather around the transfer with gloss varnish, and that basically helps soften out the edge of the transfer and make it a little less noticeable. You can also just do base color paints to go around the edge of the transfers too, but I prefer the gloss varnish method personally. You kind of want to focus the gloss varnish more around the edges rather than going over the top of the transfer, unless you're also trying to protect the transfer, which would make sense. But really, we're just trying to soften the visibility of the edges of the transfer. That's the main goal here. Some of you may have noticed that I could have potentially done the transfers at an earlier stage once my painting was finished. Then I would have gone in with the transfers, then added my oil washes over the top of the transfers. But I've learned from previous experiences that actually sometimes I don't want to put my transfers on until much later in case there's some issues with the painting process at that stage, and I might want to change my mind on a paint scheme or something like that. So I like to leave the transfers until the very end. what you can always do is add a wash over the top of the transfers and add additional weathering with oil washes and such once the gloss varnish has been added, like you can see here. You have more control. Admittedly, it isn't, of course, sitting fully blended with the previous weathering processes, but once you start stacking weathering processes on top of each other, it's not too noticeable. Especially if you do the gloss varnish thing and you make sure the transfer is sitting pretty flat with the surface. Once you've added that ultra matte varnish over the top of everything, it pretty much looks like it was there all along. And due to the sporadic and random nature of oil wash weathering, sometimes the outcome of that will dictate where I want to put the transfers. But as you can see from these parts here, the ultra matte varnish has been added over the top of everything, and it is, in my opinion, sitting quite well, and you don't really see the difference between the later weathering stages that have been put over the transfers, and I think everything is looking quite good. And honestly, from a distance, you're not going to see a single issue with any of these if they're on the gaming table. But if you are trying to make these centerpieces, then I would recommend trying to paint around the edges with the base paints that are sitting under the transfer to improve the blending even further. Now, I love subassembly due to the control that you have over painting the models in smaller pieces, but eventually you do have to fully assemble the model. The stage at which I like to fully assemble the model is when I start needing to have the entire model built for context so I can make better assessments on where I want overall highlights and overall finishes to happen. Really, on this kind of model, I want to focus in on where I want to highlight the trim, because I've already done most of my highlighting on the body panels and shading on the body panels too with the weathering. So now the model is fully assembled, I can make those judgment calls much better than when the pieces are in isolation. We also just need the model fully assembled so we can finish it and add it to a base. So this is the point with which I would like to start thinking about how I want to paint the base with this kind of color scheme on the model. I'm not going to do anything too crazy because it is actually sitting with a full set of Legion's Imperialis core box set models. So I already have a scheme in mind for the basing that I'm not going to venture too far away from, that I'll show you in the following steps. You can see on this shoulder pad that I'm pressing down here, I'm not wearing a glove because actually the ultra matte varnish is very sensitive to pressure and can peel off very easily. If you're wearing a glove, you might have some residual glue or paint on there that you might not be aware of, which can very easily rub off the ultra matte varnish. That's why I just use my bare finger sometimes. You'll also notice that I'm using super glue rather than plastic glue. That's because the model has already been painted, and I find that plastic glue can cause paint to melt quite easily along with the plastic and bubble, whereas super glue, I feel it does less of that and I find it easier to paint over too. I do love this stage because you're kind of at the end of the road and you can just focus in on much smaller details rather than doing large sweeping stuff like the body panels. You also have the opportunity now everything is in this state to make really good judgment calls on whether things are as finished as you want them to be. If you want to go a little bit harder on specific details like say the head or the feet or the weapons. Another good thing when the model is in this state is you can see if everything has the matching sort of paint job. So for example, the blue on one shoulder pad might be a little bit darker than the other, and is that something that you need to address? Those kind of calls are much easier to make, I find, when the model is in this condition. Finally, you can also consider doing weathering across multiple panels that were separate before, which are now together, so you can do oil streaks across multiple things, and that will actually hold the model together much nicer visually too. This has already been primed in black, and now we're just going in with very low pressure with a grey. The reason we're going in with low pressure with the airbrush is because I want the paint to be quite speckled, and that adds an additional layer of texture that's kind of missing from the GW bases. We will use that additional texture to our advantage when it comes to doing some dry brushing at the end of the process. Those little humps and bumps from the low pressure will be picked up with the dry brushing. The key takeaway for me is to make sure that the base feels like it almost has like a spotlight on it. Has a light section in the middle, not too obvious, but then surrounded by a darker rim. And hopefully that's coming across here. On a big flat surface like this, I prefer to get my highlights done before the oil wash stage because adding highlights in afterwards can look quite artificial. Now we get to the oil wash stage with this base. We are not doing any pre-varnishing. We are just going straight in over the top of the acrylic airbrush paint here. I have a mixture of black and brown, and I'm just dotting them sporadically next to each other. The reason why we're doing black and brown is just so there's a more varied tone changes and shifts between two colors rather than just going in with a bland black, which is sort of standard practice most of the time, but just adding one or two additional variations in tone really helps create some color shifting, and it also just seems much more natural to me. Do let this dry with just air. Don't get impatient and use a hairdryer or anything like that, because you will just blast all the oil pigment to the side of the base and ruin everything. Just let it do its thing. It might take a few hours, but just let it dry out naturally, maybe under a heat lamp or something like that, but obviously you don't want to melt the base either. Now the thinners have dried off, we can make a much better assessment of where we want to pull up some of that oil. Now, if this was a gloss varnish sitting underneath this oil layer, everything would be pulling up way too easy, and also would be mainly sitting in the recesses, and we wouldn't have too much sitting on the flat top here. But because we didn't do the varnish underneath, we can get quite aggressive with pulling up some of that oil and not worrying about it wiping off a bunch of oil in one go. The kitchen towel is an unbelievably useful tool for a process like this. It doesn't leave too many fibers, unlike a tissue. It's not hyper accurate like a makeup remover sponge would be. A regular sort of sea sponge is almost too loose and leaves too many holes and gaps and scrapes. Whereas with this, you can kind of start buffing out and just really getting accurate when you need to, and then getting really generalized when you need to. You can create scrapes and scuffs like I'm doing here with a nice dry part of the kitchen towel. Or you can start buffing like I'm doing here with one of the old used parts, which has got a lot of oil still sitting on it, which is really useful for creating more natural blends over the entire flat area. I'm now going to lock in everything I've done when it comes to the oil washing, because with dry brushing, of course, you're kind of being abrasive to the surface of the model, and I don't want to start pulling up any of that oil with my stiff brush. Instead, we're going to lock it all in and then do the dry brushing after this. I'm using a very cheap, flat and wide brush here, and just taking my time to focus in on the raised areas more than anything else. We don't want to get too caught up in the flat areas, mainly because you don't want to run the risk of creating streaks, which can so easily happen. Do make sure there's basically nothing left on the brush. You can actually see on my hand, I've done some pre-brushing on my skin, just to see how much volume of paint is on the brush before I dare touch the model, because it's going to be quite hard to fix any of those crazy streaks that you can create if you've not calculated how much paint is still left on the brush before you go in with the dry brushing. I'll then just deal with the tile seams and do a couple of scuffs in the middle, and then we're done. Next is just to add some metallic color in on these anchors that are in the corner of each of the tiles. And then add a little bit of Agrax Earthshade or any kind of wash you feel like, just to match everything up nicely with the concrete surrounding it. And finally, we have to add the model to the base. Now, I recommend doing some dry fits first, just to figure out where you want to place the Warhound, because it's quite a forward-facing model. You don't want to put it too close to one edge. Try and center it as best as you possibly can. Add some little bits of paint to the feet and then dab down where you would like to potentially put the model, and then you can scrape away that paint along with the paint layer before you attach the feet, just so it's got better adhesion. And you can even add some scouring points too with a scalpel to the feet and to the base to get even more traction. Once that's done, then paint the rim and the model is finished. And here is the Warhound with all of its weapon variants.
If
you'd like to support what I do here at Bunker 6, please consider looking at one of the links in the description, which will enable you to do so. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'm Vincent signing off from here at Bunker 6.